Close your eyes for a moment and imagine standing in a cramped, smoke-filled cottage. The year is 1347. Outside, the fields stretch endlessly under a gray European sky, and you can hear the distant sound of church bells marking the hours of labor. Inside, a blackened pot hangs over a fire that never quite dies, simmering with something that would shock you. Not because it's disgusting, but because everything you thought you knew about what medieval peasants ate was wrong. We've all heard the stories. Peasants ate nothing but stale bread and gruel. Right, they suffered through endless winters on scraps while nobles feasted on roasted meats and exotic spices. The medieval poor were malnourished, diseased, desperate creatures who barely survived on the absolute minimum. But what if I told you that this image, burned into our collective imagination by centuries of assumptions and Hollywood films, is almost entirely false? What if the reality was so different, so surprisingly complex and even sophisticated, that it would force us to completely reimagine one of history's most misunderstood groups of people? What if medieval peasants actually had access to a diversity of foods that would put some modern diets to shame? What if their meals were richer, more varied, and more nutritious than what many people eat today? Before we go any further, I want you to ask yourself something. When you picture a medieval peasant eating dinner, what do you see? Really think about it. Is it a wooden bowl filled with watery porridge? A hard crust of dark bread? Maybe some kind of unidentifiable slop? Now hold on to that image, because by the time we're finished here, you're going to realize just how much the picture has been distorted by myth, prejudice, and our own modern assumptions about the past. The truth about what medieval peasants actually ate is buried under centuries of misconceptions. It's hidden in forgotten cookbooks, agricultural records, archaeological digs, and the chemical analysis of bones pulled from medieval graveyards. And when you start to uncover this truth, when you begin to see the real complexity of peasant foodways, you realize something disturbing. We've been lied to, not necessarily intentionally, but through a combination of class prejudice, incomplete historical records, and our own modern biases about what constitutes good food. Let me hit you with something that should immediately shake your assumptions. Chemical analysis of medieval peasant bones, conducted by researchers at the University of Bristol and published in the Journal of Archaeological Science, has revealed something shocking. The isotope signatures in these bones, which tell us what people actually consumed over their lifetimes, show a diet far more varied and protein-rich than historians had assumed. We're not talking about slight variations. We're talking about evidence that completely contradicts the starving peasant narrative. Dr. Julie Dunn, who led some of this research, found residues in medieval pottery that reveal peasants were cooking with and consuming a stunning variety of ingredients, dairy products, yes, but also leafy vegetables, legumes, fish, and even meat far more regularly than previously thought. The chemical fingerprints don't lie. These people weren't just surviving. In many cases, they were eating better than their descendants would during the Industrial Revolution. But here's where it gets really interesting. The medieval period we're talking about spans roughly 1,000 years, from the 5th century to the 15th century. That's longer than the entire history of the United States. And during the time, what peasants ate varied enormously depending on where they lived, what century they lived in, whether there was war or peace, plague or prosperity, and what social and economic systems governed their access to food. A peasant in 11th century England ate very differently from a peasant in 14th century France. A peasant in coastal Norway had access to foods that a peasant in landlocked Bavaria could only dream of. And yet, despite this enormous variation, certain patterns emerge. Patterns that reveal a sophisticated understanding of nutrition, seasonality, preservation, and flavor that we've completely underestimated. So let's start at the beginning. Let's talk about bread, because everyone assumes they know about medieval peasant bread. Dark, heavy, full of impurities, maybe even sawdust mixed in to stretch the flour, right? Well, yes and no. This is where things get complicated. because the reality is so much more nuanced than the myth. First, bread was indeed central to the medieval peasant diet. In many regions, bread provided between 50 and 70% of total caloric intake. But here's what most people don't understand. Medieval people recognized different grades of bread, and these grades weren't just about white versus brown or rich versus poor. They were sophisticated classifications that medieval people understood in the same way. We understand the difference between sourdough, whole wheat, and white bread today. The highest quality bread was called pandemain or wastel in England, manchet in some regions. This was made from finely sifted white wheat flour, and yes, peasants rarely ate it, but they knew it existed. They baked it sometimes for their lords. They might taste it at festivals or holy days, but their everyday bread was different. The most common peasant bread in most of medieval Europe was made from a mixture of grains. Not just wheat, but rye, barley, oats, and sometimes even beans or peas ground into the flour. This wasn't because they were trying to stretch their supplies with inferior ingredients, though that did happen in famine years. It was because this mixed grain bread was actually more nutritious and, in many cases, more flavorful than pure white wheat bread. Archaeological evidence from medieval ovens and cooking sites, documented by researchers like Dr. Christopher Dyer at the University of Leicester, shows that these mixed grain breads were often quite sophisticated. They were leavened, which means peasants understood and maintained sourdough cultures or had access to brewing yeasts. The bread had real structure, real flavor, and substantial nutritional value. But here's something that should make you stop and think. The quality of peasant bread varied enormously with the harvest. In a good year, when wheat was abundant, even peasants might eat bread made primarily from wheat. In a bad year, the proportion of cheaper grains increased. In a famine year, things got desperate, and yes, sometimes tree bark or other fillers made their way into the flour. This variability is crucial to understanding medieval peasant food, because it means we can't make simple generalizations. A peasant's diet in 1250 during a time of relative prosperity was vastly different from a peasant's diet in 1315 during the Great Famine, which we'll talk about more later. The same family might eat well one year and desperately the next. Now, let's talk about something that completely explodes the myth of the starving medieval peasant. Pottage. If you've heard of pottage at all, you probably think of it as some kind of thin, unappetizing gruel. But that's not what pottage was, not even close. Pottage was the centerpiece of the medieval peasant meal, and it was actually a sophisticated, nutritious, and often delicious dish. Think of it as somewhere between a thick soup and a stew. It simmered constantly in that cauldron over the fire, and into it went an incredible variety of ingredients. The base was usually grain. Oats were common in northern regions, barley in others, sometimes wheat, sometimes a mixture. But then came the vegetables. And this is where things get really interesting, because medieval peasants had access to and regularly consumed a range of vegetables. That would surprise you. Onions, leeks, and garlic were staples. They grew easily, stored well, and added enormous flavor to pottage cabbages, both the headed varieties we recognize today and loose-leaf varieties, were everywhere. Peas and beans, both fresh and dried, were absolutely central to the medieval peasant diet and provided crucial protein. Root vegetables were vital: turnips, parsnips, carrots. Though the carrots they knew were often purple or yellow rather than the orange varieties we are familiar with today. Beets, radishes, all of these found their way into the pottage pot. Leafy greens were consumed in quantities that might shock modern people. Kale, which we now consider a trendy superfood, was a medieval peasant staple. So were various types of beet greens, dandelion greens, nettles, which are actually highly nutritious when cooked, and a whole range of wild and cultivated greens that modern people have largely forgotten. Herbs flavored everything. Parsley was ubiquitous. So were various types of what we'd call pot herbs, sage, thyme, and others. These weren't luxuries. They grew in peasant gardens and added not just flavor, but nutritional value to meals. Now here's something crucial. All of these vegetables and herbs provided medieval peasants with vitamins, minerals, and fiber that kept them healthier than you'd expect. Analysis of medieval peasant skeletons shows that, outside of famine periods, nutritional deficiency diseases were actually relatively rare. These people were getting what they needed, but we haven't even talked about the protein in pottage yet. And this is where things get really controversial, because it challenges one of the most persistent myths about medieval peasants: the myth that they rarely or never ate meat. Let's be clear about something. Peasants didn't eat meat every day. They weren't sitting down to roasted joints and whole birds the way nobles were. But the idea that they almost never consumed animal protein is simply false. And we know this from multiple sources. First, there's the archaeological evidence. Medieval peasant settlements, when excavated, contained substantial quantities of animal bones, pig bones especially, but also cattle, sheep, goats, and poultry. Chemical analysis of these bones shows butchering marks consistent with consumption, not just with the use of animals for leather or other purposes. Second, there are the manorial records. These documents, which recorded the obligations and privileges of peasants on medieval estates, often mention the right to keep pigs, chickens, and sometimes other small livestock. Pigs were particularly important because they could forage in woods and commons, turning vegetation humans couldn't eat into valuable meat and fat. Dr. Christopher Woolger at the University of Southampton has done extensive research on this, analyzing thousands of medieval household accounts and records. His findings suggest that peasants in many regions consumed meat at least once a week, and more often during certain seasons. But here's the thing. Peasants weren't always eating what we'd call the best cuts. They ate variety meats, organs, blood, heads and feet, parts that nobles often didn't want. But these parts are often highly nutritious. Liver, for instance, is packed with vitamins. Blood sausage, which was common, is rich in iron. And much of this meat went into the constantly simmering pot of pottage. A ham bone would flavor the pot for days. Bacon fat would enrich it. Occasional pieces of pork or chicken would boost both flavor and nutrition. But we need to talk about something else. Something that really challenges modern assumptions: fish. Medieval peasants ate a lot of fish, far more than most people realize. The medieval Christian calendar mandated abstinence from meat on Fridays, during Lent, and on various other days throughout the year. This amounted to about half the days of the year. On these days, fish replaced meat, and while nobles might eat exotic imported fish and elaborate fish dishes, peasants had their own fish sources. If you lived near the coast or a river, fresh fish was available. But even inland peasants had access to preserved fish. Salted herring was ubiquitous in northern Europe, so common, in fact, that regulations had to be put in place to ensure quality. Dried fish, especially cod, was traded extensively. Smoked fish appeared in markets and on peasant tables. The economic historian Bruce Campbell has documented this extensively. His research into medieval English port records shows absolutely massive quantities of fish being imported and distributed. This wasn't all going to nobles. The math doesn't work unless peasants were eating significant amounts of fish, and here's something that should make you reconsider the whole medieval peasant diet. Fish isn't just protein. Fatty fish like herring provides omega-3 fatty acids, which are crucial for brain and heart health. Dried fish provides calcium when you eat the bones. Medieval peasants, through their fish consumption, were getting nutrients that many modern people actively struggle to incorporate into their diets. Now let's talk about dairy, because this is another area where the reality differs sharply from the myth. Medieval peasants consumed substantial amounts of dairy products, though not always in the forms we might expect. Fresh milk was actually relatively rare in many peasant households. Milk spoils quickly and without refrigeration. Keeping it fresh was a challenge, but medieval people were experts at preservation, and they transformed milk into products that could last. Cheese was everywhere. Hard cheeses could be aged and stored for months or even years. Softer cheeses were consumed more quickly, but appeared regularly on peasant tables. The varieties were numerous, ranging from simple fresh cheeses to complex aged varieties. Butter was a staple in Northern Europe, though less common in southern regions where olive oil predominated. Butter could be salted for preservation, and while the best butter might go to markets or to the lord's household, peasants definitely made and consumed their own. Buttermilk, the liquid left after churning butter, was consumed as a beverage and used in cooking. It's tangy, refreshing, and quite nutritious, and while we might turn our noses up at it today, medieval peasants valued it. In some regions, especially Eastern Europe, fermented milk products similar to yogurt or kefir appeared in the diet. These provided probiotics and preserved milk's nutritional value while extending its usable life. The research of Dr. Sonia Kurth at the University of East Anglia on medieval dairying practices has revealed just how sophisticated and central dairy production was to peasant households, particularly for women who often controlled these activities and the income they generated. But we need to address something that complicates this picture. Access to all of these foods wasn't equal or guaranteed. Medieval society was rigidly hierarchical, and that hierarchy extended the food access in complex ways. In the manorial system that dominated much of medieval Europe, peasants owed obligations to their lords. They had to work the lord's land for a certain number of days per year. They had to pay rents, often in the form of a portion of their harvest. They faced restrictions on hunting, on keeping certain animals, on using forest resources. Hunting large game was generally forbidden to peasants. Deer, wild boar. These were reserved for the nobility. Poaching was a serious crime, though it certainly happened. But peasants could and did trap small game, catch fish in rivers and streams, and hunt birds in some circumstances. Forest resources were crucial, but often restricted. Peasants might have the right to gather fallen wood, but not to cut living trees. They might be able to forage for mushrooms, nuts, berries, and wild herbs, but face restrictions on grazing pigs in the forest or hunting there. These restrictions created genuine hardship and resentment. The medieval period saw periodic revolts, and access to food resources was often a trigger. The famous phrase from the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, when Adam delved and Eve span, "Who was then the gentleman?" expressed a fundamental anger at social inequality, including inequality in access to food. But here's what's important to understand. Even within these restrictions, even with these obligations and hierarchies, medieval peasants had developed systems to feed themselves that were far more sophisticated than we generally recognize. The medieval three-field system of agriculture, for instance, wasn't just about growing grain for bread. One field would be planted with winter wheat or rye, another with spring crops like oats, barley, or legumes. The third would lie fallow, often used for grazing. This rotation maintained soil fertility and ensured a diversity of crops. But beyond the great fields, peasants maintained household gardens and had access to common lands. These gardens, typically tended by women, were incredibly productive. They grew the vegetables, herbs, and sometimes fruit that supplemented the grain-based diet. Fruit deserves its own discussion because it's another area where assumptions mislead us. Medieval peasants had access to a variety of fruits, though not the tropical and exotic varieties that grace noble tables. Apples were ubiquitous in appropriate climates. So were pears. Both were eaten fresh in season and dried or preserved for winter consumption. Cherries, plums, and various types of berries appeared seasonally. In southern Europe, grapes were common, and not just for wine. Medieval varieties of these fruits were often different from modern ones. Apples, for instance, were often smaller and more tart, better suited for cooking and cider making than eating fresh. But they were nutritious and appeared regularly in peasant diets. Wild fruits supplemented cultivated varieties. Blackberries, raspberries, wild strawberries, sloes, rosehips, elderberries, and many others were gathered from hedgerows, forests, and wastelands. These gathering expeditions were social events, often undertaken by children and women. And they provided not just food, but a connection to the landscape and the seasons. Now let's talk about something that might seem trivial but actually mattered enormously: flavor. We tend to assume that peasant food was bland, unseasoned, monotonous. But that assumption reveals our modern prejudices more than historical reality. Peasants couldn't afford expensive imported spices like cinnamon, cloves, or pepper, which were literally worth their weight in gold. These were luxury items that signaled wealth and status. The peasants had their own flavor palette, and it was surprisingly complex. We've already mentioned herbs like parsley, sage, and thyme. But the medieval herb garden contained many more varieties: fennel, both the bulb and the fronds, dill, coriander, mint, rosemary in warmer climates. These weren't ornamental. They were used daily in cooking. Alliums, the onion family, were fundamental. Onions, leeks, garlic, and various types of wild garlic all added pungency and depth to dishes. Medieval people understood that these ingredients didn't just add flavor, but had preservative and medicinal qualities. Mustard was a peasant spice. It could be grown relatively easily, and mustard seeds could be ground into a paste that added heat and complexity to food. In some regions, horseradish served a similar purpose. Vinegar was common and important, made from sour wine, cider, or beer. It preserved foods and added acidity that balanced and brightened flavors. Medieval peasants understood the principle that we now call umami, the savory depth that comes from fermented and preserved foods. Salt was crucial, but often expensive. Coastal areas had better access, either from sea salt or from areas with salt springs. Inland regions sometimes faced genuine salt shortages. But medieval people developed techniques to maximize the salt they had, using it for preservation and seasoning strategically. And speaking of preservation, we need to talk about the techniques medieval peasants used to ensure food availability year-round, because this is where their sophistication really shows. Drying was fundamental. Beans, peas, and other legumes were dried and stored. Fruits were dried. Fish and meat were dried. Herbs were dried. This process reduced weight and volume, prevented spoilage, and locked in nutrients. Salting preserved meat and fish. The process was well understood, and while it made food salty, it worked. Salted pork, bacon, and fish could last for months before cooking. Salted foods could be soaked to remove excess salt. Smoking combined preservation with flavor. Smokehouses, or simply the constant smoke from cooking fires, preserved and flavored meat, fish, and cheese. The fennels and smoke act as preservatives, and medieval people knew this empirically even if they didn't understand the chemistry. Pickling in vinegar or brine preserved vegetables. Cabbage became sauerkraut, a process of fermentation that actually increased nutritional value by creating probiotics and vitamin C. Cucumbers, onions, and other vegetables went into crocks of brine or vinegar. Cold storage in cellars or even in streams worked for some foods. Root vegetables could be kept in cool, dark cellars for months. Some foods were packed in snow or ice when available. These preservation techniques meant that the medieval peasant diet, while definitely seasonal, wasn't as limited in winter as you might think. The winter pot of pottage might contain dry beans, salted pork, stored root vegetables, and dried herbs. It wouldn't be the fresh abundance of summer, but it would be nourishing. Now let me hit you with something that really challenges our assumptions about medieval life. Ale. Medieval peasants drank ale. A lot of ale. And this wasn't because they were all drunks. There were very practical reasons. Water quality in medieval settlements was often questionable. People didn't understand germ theory, but they empirically knew that water from certain sources made you sick. Ale, on the other hand, was safe. The brewing process, which involved boiling the water, killed pathogens. The alcohol content further inhibited bacterial growth. But medieval ale wasn't like modern beer. It was lower in alcohol, often around to 2–3%. It was consumed daily, even by children, as a source of hydration and calories. A typical peasant might consume 2–3 liters a day. Ale was made from malted barley, water, and flavorings. Before hops became common, various herbs and plants were used for flavoring and preservation. A mixture called group might include bog myrtle, yarrow, mugwort, and other plants. Brewing was typically women's work, another crucial female-controlled activity in peasant households. Good brewers were valued in their communities, and ale represented both nutrition and a potential source of income. The calories in ale were significant. This daily ale consumption might have provided 10 to 20% of total caloric intake. And while we might worry about the health effects of drinking that much alcohol, the low alcohol content and the fact that it replaced potentially contaminated water probably made it a net positive for health. In some regions, cider served a similar role, especially in apple-growing areas. Made from fermented apple juice, it was another safe source of hydration and calories. Now we need to talk about something darker: famine. Because as much as I've been painting a picture of a surprisingly adequate and diverse peasant diet, the truth is that medieval peasants lived with the constant threat of starvation. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 provides a harrowing example. Triggered by a combination of catastrophic weather, crop failures, and livestock disease, this famine killed millions across northern Europe. During these years, everything we've been discussing, all that dietary diversity and adequacy, collapsed. Grain prices skyrocketed. Salt prices, crucial for preservation, quadrupled. People ate their seed grain, which meant the next year's crop was doomed before it started. They slaughtered their breeding animals. They consumed everything edible, including things that normally wouldn't be considered food. Medieval chronicles from this period describe horrors. People eating grass and tree bark, reports of cannibalism. Though historians debate how widespread this actually was, mass death in cities and countryside alike. The weather pattern that triggered this famine. Years of excessive rain that rotted crops in the field and prevented harvests was beyond medieval people's ability to control. They could pray. They could process in the streets bearing holy relics. They could do penance for their sins, but they couldn't stop the rain. What's crucial to understand is how vulnerable medieval peasants were to these climate and harvest disruptions. Without modern transportation networks, a famine in one region couldn't easily be relieved by surplus from another. Without food storage infrastructure, bad years quickly became disastrous. And famines, while this one was particularly severe, weren't rare. Regional crop failures and food shortages occurred frequently. Medieval peasants lived their entire lives knowing that one bad harvest could mean death. This vulnerability makes the sophistication of their normal diet even more impressive. The preservation techniques, the dietary diversity, the agricultural systems, all of these represented strategies to create resilience against this ever-present threat. They didn't always work, but they were the best medieval people could do with the knowledge and resources they had. Let's shift now and talk about regional variations, because medieval Europe was far from uniform. A peasant in Norway ate very differently from a peasant in Italy. And these differences reveal how local environment and culture shape foodways. In Scandinavia, fish was even more central than in other regions. Coastal communities relied heavily on fishing and preserved fish, especially stockfish. Dried cod that became hard as wood and could last indefinitely was a staple. Scandinavian peasants also consumed more dairy than Southern Europeans, and porridges made from oats and barley were common in the Mediterranean regions. Olive oil replaced butter as the primary fat. Olive cultivation was central to agriculture, and even peasants had access to olive oil for cooking and flavoring. Vegetables figured even more prominently in the diet here. Garlic, onions, and various greens were consumed in abundance. Wine was more common than ale, and it served similar purposes as a safe beverage. The availability of fish in Mediterranean regions was different too. Fresh fish from the sea was accessible to coastal peasants, and preserved fish like salted anchovies and sardines were common. But the variety of fish species was different from northern waters. In Eastern Europe, buckwheat became important as a grain, supplementing or replacing wheat and rye in some areas. Fermented foods, including various types of pickled vegetables and fermented milk products, were even more prominent than in Western Europe. In each region, we see peasants adapting to their local environment, making use of what was available, and developing distinct food cultures that were sophisticated in their own ways. The idea of a single, uniform medieval peasant diet is simply false. We should also talk about seasonality, because the medieval diet changed dramatically through the year in ways that modern people, with our year-round access to almost any food, struggle to imagine. Spring, after the lean months of late winter, brought green things. Fresh vegetables from early gardens, wild greens that could be foraged. This was a time of renewal, but also potential scarcity, as stored foods from the previous harvest ran low and new crops hadn't yet matured. Early summer brought abundance: peas, beans, and other fresh vegetables, soft fruits, fresh dairy products in abundance as cows grazed on lush pasture. This was a time of plenty, but it was also a time of intense agricultural labor as hay had to be cut and crops tended. Late summer and autumn brought the harvest, the most critical time of the agricultural year. Grain harvest determined whether the coming year would bring plenty or want. This was also the time to gather nuts from the forest, to make preserves, to begin the work of ensuring winter's survival. Autumn was slaughtering time for animals that couldn't be kept through winter. Pigs especially were fattened on acorns and farce massed and then slaughtered. The work of preserving this meat, of rendering fat, of making sausages and blood puddings, all of this happened in a flurry of activity. Winter brought a shift to stored and preserved foods. The diet became heavier on grains, dried legumes, salted and smoked meats, and root vegetables from the cellar. Fresh food was scarce, but if preparations had been adequate, the winter diet could still be nourishing. This seasonal cycle meant that medieval peasants lived in a rhythm with nature that most modern people have lost. They knew intimately when each food would be available. They celebrated seasonal abundance and endured seasonal scarcity. Their culture, their festivals, even their religious calendar reflected this deep connection to the agricultural and food cycle. Now let's talk about something that might surprise you even more: feasts. Because medieval peasants didn't just endure a grim existence of bare subsistence. They celebrated, they feasted, and these feasts reveal a lot about their relationship with food. Religious holidays provided occasions for celebration and better eating. Christmas, Easter, major saints' days, all of these might involve special foods. A household that normally ate meat once a week might have a roasted bird or a better cut of meat on a major feast day. Harvest festivals celebrated the successful bringing in of crops. These were community events with abundant food and drink. The best of the new harvest would be consumed, a celebration of survival and plenty. Weddings, baptisms, and other life events called for feasts that might strain a household's resources, but demonstrated hospitality and strengthened community bonds. Neighbors would contribute, and the feast became a communal event. What did they eat at these feasts? Better versions of the foods they normally consumed. More meat, more variety, richer pottage thick with vegetables and meat, better bread. More ale or wine. Sweets and treats that were rare in everyday life might appear. Honey cakes, fruit preserves, special cheeses. These feasts weren't just about consumption. They were social glue. They redistributed resources within the community. They created obligations and relationships. They provided psychological relief from the hardships of medieval peasant life. And they demonstrate that medieval peasants value pleasure, community, and celebration, not just survival. Let me ask you something now. When you think about all of this, when you consider the diversity, the sophistication, the resilience of the medieval peasant diet, what does it make you feel? Does it challenge your assumptions about these people? Does it make you see them differently? Because I think one of the most important things we can do is recognize that medieval peasants weren't simple, ignorant, suffering creatures who barely survived on scraps. They were complex people living in a complex society, and their relationship with food was sophisticated in ways that deserve respect. But we're not done, because there's another layer to this that we need to explore: the question of nutrition. How healthy were medieval peasants actually? What can modern science tell us about their physical condition? Skeletal analysis provides some of the best evidence. Researchers like Dr. Tony Waldron, whose work on medieval bone pathology is considered foundational, have examined thousands of medieval skeletons. What they found is nuanced, outside of famine periods. Evidence of severe malnutrition is actually less common than you might expect. Bones show adequate mineralization, suggesting sufficient calcium and vitamin D. Teeth, while they had cavities, show less decay than teeth from later periods, probably because medieval diets contained far less refined sugar. Average height provides another indicator. Medieval peasants were shorter than modern people, but not drastically so. Men average around 5 feet 6 inches, women around 5 feet 2 inches. This is shorter than modern averages, but not dramatically different from populations in the early 20th century before modern nutrition. What's more interesting is that height declined in later periods. People in the early medieval period were actually slightly taller on average than people in the later medieval period, and both groups were taller than people during the Industrial Revolution. This suggests that, in some ways, medieval peasants were better nourished than their descendants would be. Evidence of childhood stress, visible in bones and teeth as growth interruptions, appears in medieval skeletons but not universally. This suggests that while childhood could be difficult, it wasn't uniformly horrific. Many children grew up adequately nourished. What did cause problems? Infectious disease was a major killer, but that's different from malnutrition. Heavy labor led to joint problems and injuries. Dental abscesses and tooth loss, while less severe than in later periods, still occurred. But here's something that should really make you think. Life expectancy at birth in the medieval period was low, around 30 to 35 years. But this figure is heavily skewed by high infant and child mortality. If you survive to adulthood, your chances of living into your 50s or even 60s were reasonable. And while diet wasn't the only factor in this, the evidence suggests that it wasn't primarily malnutrition killing medieval peasants. It was disease, accidents, and the dangers of childbirth for women. Now we need to talk about something that has been sort of lurking in the background of this entire discussion. Class. Because the medieval world was obsessed with class distinctions, and food was one of the primary ways these distinctions were marked and enforced. Sumptuary laws in some regions actually regulated who could eat what. While these laws focused mostly on clothing, the principle extended to food. Certain foods, certain spices, certain dishes were considered inappropriate for lower-class consumption. But more than laws, social norms dictated that there was high-status food and low-status food. White bread was high status. Dark bread was low status. Roasted meat was high status. Boiled or stewed meat was low status. Spices were high status. Herbs were low status. These distinctions were about more than just cost. They were about identity. Nobles eating white bread and roasted meat with expensive spices were performing their noble identity. Peasants eating dark bread and pottage were, in the eyes of the elite, fulfilling their natural role in the social order. Medieval writers, virtually all of whom were from the upper classes, reinforced these ideas. They described peasant food with disdain, emphasizing its coarseness and simplicity. They can imagine that someone might actually prefer a bowl of well-made pottage to some of the elaborate and often bizarre dishes served at noble tables. But here's the thing. Some modern nutritionists and food historians have argued that the medieval peasant diet was, in many ways, healthier than the noble diet. Nobles consumed enormous quantities of meat, often to the exclusion of vegetables and fiber. They suffered from gout, obesity, and other diet-related illnesses that peasants rarely experienced. The peasant diet, rich in whole grains, legumes, vegetables, and with moderate amounts of meat and fish, actually looks quite good from a modern nutritional standpoint. High in fiber, decent protein, plenty of vitamins and minerals. If we were designing a healthy diet today, it might look surprisingly similar to what a medieval peasant ate, minus the vulnerability to famine. This is speculative, but it's worth considering. What if the class prejudice that made nobles disdain peasant food was actually causing nobles to eat in ways that damaged their health? What if the peasants, in their supposedly lowly pottage and dark bread, had stumbled onto something nutritionally superior? We can't know for certain, but the evidence points in the direction, and it should make us question our assumptions about who was civilized and who was barbaric, who lived well and who suffered, who understood food and who didn't. Let's talk now about something that's absolutely crucial to understanding medieval peasant food, but often overlooked: the role of women. Because food production, preparation, and preservation in peasant households was overwhelmingly women's work, and this gave women significant power and responsibility. Women tended the household gardens that provided vegetables and herbs. Women milked cows and goats, made cheese and butter, and managed dairy production. Women brewed ale, which was both nutrition and potential income. Women did much of the work of preserving and storing food for winter. And women cooked. They maintained the constantly simmering pot of pottage, baked bread, and prepared meals. This wasn't considered lowly work in the way modern people sometimes view it. It was essential. A skilled cook and food manager could make the difference between a household that ate well and one that struggled. Women also controlled some of the economic aspects of food. They might sell surplus eggs, butter, cheese, or ale at market. This income, while probably not large, was theirs to control and could provide a degree of economic independence. The food knowledge that women held was extensive. They knew which herbs to use for flavor and for medicine. They knew preservation techniques passed down through generations. They understood seasonality and how to maximize limited resources. This knowledge was transmitted from mother to daughter, creating a chain of expertise that stretched back generations. Medieval recipe collections, rare as they are, sometimes reveal that they were copied and adapted by women, passed along as valuable family assets. But we should be careful not to romanticize. Women's work in medieval peasant households was hard, constant, and often undervalued. Women faced restrictions, discrimination, and dangers that men didn't. But in the realm of food, they held real knowledge and power. Now I want to talk about something that's going to sound almost too strange to believe. Theories about medieval peasant food that challenge everything we think we know. Because some researchers have proposed ideas that, if true, would completely revolutionize our understanding. One controversial theory, proposed by some economic historians, suggests that medieval peasants in some regions and periods might have actually consumed more calories per day than average people in the modern developed world. The argument goes that the intense physical labor of medieval agricultural work required enormous caloric intake, possibly 3,500 to 4,000 calories per day for adult men doing field work. If this is true, and the evidence is debated, it means medieval peasants weren't just adequately fed. They were eating huge quantities of food. That's why bread and pottage were so central. They're calorie-dense and could be consumed in large amounts. Another theory, this one more widely accepted, is that medieval peasant populations might have developed genetic adaptations to their diet. The ability of many Northern Europeans to digest lactose into adulthood, for instance, is thought to have become more common during the medieval period, in response to the centrality of dairy in the diet. Similarly, some geneticists have proposed that the heavy reliance on grain-based diets might have selected for certain digestive characteristics in medieval populations. This is speculative, but if true, it would mean that medieval peasants were literally evolving in response to their food system. A more controversial speculation involves the potential health effects of mycotoxins in stored grain. We know that grain storage in medieval conditions wasn't perfect, and mold growth could occur. Some mycotoxins have psychoactive properties. Could periodic consumption of contaminated grain have contributed to some of the visions, fits, and mass hysteria events recorded in medieval chronicles? This is purely speculative, and most historians are skeptical. But it's the kind of question that modern scientific analysis might eventually help us answer. If we could analyze residues from medieval grain storage vessels and find evidence of specific mold species, it might support or refute this theory. Let me ask you this. If we discover tomorrow that medieval peasants were regularly consuming something we didn't know about, something that had significant nutritional or even psychoactive effects, how would that change our understanding of the medieval world? What if there was an entire category of medieval food that hasn't survived in the historical record? This might sound far-fetched, but we do know that some medieval food practices have been lost. Specific varieties of vegetables and fruits have gone extinct. Preservation techniques have been forgotten. It's possible, even likely, that there are aspects of the medieval peasant diet that we simply don't know about because they weren't recorded. The written record is biased toward elite concerns. Peasants left few records of their own. What we know comes largely from account books, tax records, agricultural manuals, and occasional mentions in chronicles. All of these sources have limitations they might miss. Commonplace things that everyone knew about and therefore didn't bother to record. Archaeology helps fill in gaps, but it too has limitations. Organic materials decay. We can find animal bones and pottery, but the actual contents of that pot, the specific plants in that garden, might be lost forever. So when we reconstruct the medieval peasant diet, we're always working with incomplete information. We're making educated guesses based on the evidence we have, and that means there's always the possibility that new evidence could change everything. Let's talk about something else now. The global context. Because while we've been focusing on European peasants, food systems, and peasant diets in other parts of the medieval world were developing along different lines, and these comparisons are instructive. In the medieval Islamic world, agricultural innovation was happening at a pace that Europe wouldn't match for centuries. New crops were being introduced and spread. Sophisticated irrigation systems were being built. Urban food markets were more developed than anything in medieval Europe. Peasants in the Islamic world had access to a wider variety of fruits and vegetables. Citrus fruits, which were luxury items in Europe, were more common. Rice was a staple in many regions. Spices that Europeans considered precious were used more freely. In China during the Song dynasty, which corresponds to the European High Medieval period, agricultural productivity was reaching levels that wouldn't be matched in Europe. Until the modern era, rice cultivation was highly sophisticated. Urban food markets in Chinese cities dwarfed anything in medieval Europe. Chinese peasants, while they certainly faced hardships and famines, generally had access to a more diverse vegetable-based diet than European peasants. Soy products, virtually unknown in medieval Europe, provided plant-based protein. Tea, both as a beverage and for medicinal purposes, was consumed widely in the Americas. Before European contact, indigenous agricultural systems supported large populations. Maize, beans, and squash formed a complementary triad that provided balanced nutrition. In the Andes, potato cultivation at high altitudes supported dense populations. These comparisons aren't meant to suggest that European peasants were somehow uniquely deprived. Rather, they demonstrate that food systems develop in response to specific environmental, technological, and cultural contexts. European peasants worked with what they had and developed sophisticated systems adapted to their specific circumstances. But it's worth noting that when crops from other parts of the world eventually reached Europe, they transformed European agriculture and diets. Potatoes, maize, tomatoes, all of these would become staples, but none were available to medieval European peasants. It makes you wonder how different things might have been if they had been. Now we need to talk about religion, because in medieval Europe, religion permeated every aspect of life, and that definitely included food. We've already mentioned the fasting rules that mandated fish instead of meat on Fridays and during Lent, but the religious dimensions of food went much deeper. Saying grace before meals was universal. Food was understood as God's gift. Wasting food was considered sinful. The Christian concept of charity meant that feeding the hungry was a religious obligation. Monasteries and parish churches often distributed food to the poor. While this charity might not have been enough to prevent starvation during famines, it was part of the social safety net. Religious feast days provided both spiritual meaning and an occasion for better eating. Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, the feast days of local patron saints, all of these were times when both spiritual observance and dietary celebration occurred together. The religious rules could also create hardship. The prohibition on meat during fast periods meant that even peasants who might have had access to meat were forbidden from eating it. In practice, this prohibition was probably not always strictly observed, but it did shape when and how meat was consumed. There were also folk beliefs and practices around food that existed in tension with official church teaching. Beliefs in the magical properties of certain foods and food as medicine and dietary practices connected to folk healing. All of these persisted despite occasional church disapproval. Interestingly, some scholars have argued that Christian fasting rules might have actually improved medieval nutrition by enforcing dietary diversity. The requirement to abstain from meat forced the consumption of fish and vegetables, while the intention was spiritual. The effect might have been better balanced nutrition. Let's consider now what happened at the end of the medieval period. How did peasant food begin to change? What transitions were occurring that would eventually lead to the very different food systems of the early modern period? Population growth in the 13th century put pressure on food systems. More people meant more land brought under cultivation, including marginal lands less suitable for agriculture. This increased vulnerability to bad harvests. The Black Death, which killed perhaps a third of Europe's population in the mid-14th century, paradoxically improved conditions for surviving peasants. Labor became scarce and therefore valuable. Wages rose. Food prices fell. Peasants had more bargaining power. For a period after the plague, many peasants ate better than they had before. They consumed more meat and better bread. They demanded and received higher wages that allowed them to purchase foods that had previously been out of reach. But by the 15th century, as population recovered, these gains began to erode. Lords attempted to reassert control. Wages stagnated. The food situation began to resemble the pre-plague conditions. New crops began to appear, though slowly. By the late medieval period, some vegetables that we now consider common were being introduced. But the real agricultural revolution, which would transform European food systems, was still in the future. Urban growth was beginning to change food systems in cities. More sophisticated markets were developing. Long-distance food trade was increasing. But for rural peasants, these changes might have been barely noticeable. The printing press, developed in the mid-15th century, would eventually lead to wider dissemination of agricultural and culinary knowledge. But in the medieval period we've been discussing, knowledge transmission remained largely oral and practical. Now I want to circle back to something crucial. The question of why we got the medieval peasant diet so wrong. Why did the myth of starvation and deprivation become so entrenched? Part of the answer is class prejudice, both medieval and modern. Medieval elites looked down on peasant food and peasants. Their writings, which form much of our historical record, reflect this prejudice. They had no interest in accurately describing peasant diets. They assumed peasants ate poorly because peasants were poor, and that seemed like the natural order of things. Modern historians, until relatively recently, often uncritically accepted these medieval elite perspectives. They assumed that life for the poor in the past must have been uniformly miserable. This fit with narratives of progress, the idea that things are always getting better, that modern people are better off than people in the past. Popular culture reinforced these ideas. Movies and television depicting the medieval period almost always show peasants as filthy, starving wretches. This makes for dramatic contrast with noble splendor, but it's not historically accurate. There's also been a tendency to focus on crisis periods. Famines and plagues are dramatic and well documented. Normal times, when things were working adequately, are less dramatic and less likely to be written about. This creates a skewed picture where the exceptional becomes the typical in our imagination. The lack of peasant voices in the historical record is crucial. Peasants didn't write about what they ate. When they appear in records, it's usually in the context of obligations, crimes, or complaints. We don't have peasant recipe books or food diaries. We have to reconstruct their diet from indirect evidence. Modern scientific methods, particularly archaeological science, have begun to correct these misunderstandings. Chemical analysis of bones and pottery, analysis of preserved plant remains, systematic study of agricultural records, all of these have given us a more accurate picture. But the old myths persist in popular culture. The starving, miserable peasant eating nothing but gruel is too entrenched in our collective imagination to be easily dislodged. And maybe that's because, on some level, we want to believe that life in the past was worse. It makes us feel better about the present. Let me ask you something now, and I want you to really think about it. Knowing what you now know about medieval peasant food, would you eat a medieval peasant's diet for a month? Not during a famine year, but during a normal year. Could you live on pottage, dark bread, cheese, ale, seasonal vegetables, occasional fish and meat, and herbs from the garden? Some of you might be thinking that sounds terrible, but others might realize that it doesn't sound that different from some modern diets. Remove the ale and add coffee, and you've basically described a pretty healthy modern diet. Whole grains, vegetables, legumes, moderate animal protein. That's what nutritionists recommend. Of course, there are differences. Medieval peasants didn't have the variety we have. They couldn't eat tropical fruits or out-of-season vegetables. They didn't have refined sugar or processed foods. But in terms of basic nutritional adequacy, their diet might actually compare favorably to what many modern people eat. This raises uncomfortable questions about progress and poverty. If medieval peasants, supposedly among the poorest and most oppressed people in history, ate a reasonably adequate and nutritious diet outside of crisis periods, what does that say about poverty and food insecurity in the modern world today? In wealthy countries, poor people often suffer from malnutrition, but it's the malnutrition of processed, nutrient-poor foods. Cheap calories are abundant. Nutritious food is expensive. This is a very different food poverty than what medieval peasants experienced. But it's still food poverty. And globally, food insecurity remains a massive problem. Hundreds of millions of people don't have reliable access to adequate nutrition. This is partly a distribution problem, partly a poverty problem, partly a climate and agriculture problem. But it's worth noting that we have technology and resources that medieval people could never have imagined, and yet we haven't eliminated hunger. Maybe there's something we can learn from medieval peasant food systems. Not that we should go back to them, but that we should understand what they got right. The emphasis on local, seasonal foods, the sophisticated preservation techniques, the dietary diversity based on many different plants and moderate animal consumption. The connections between food, community, and culture. Modern food systems have given us abundance and variety that medieval people couldn't imagine. But they've also disconnected us from the sources of our food, from the seasons, from the knowledge of how to grow and preserve food. There's a growing movement to recover some of what was lost, to eat locally and seasonally, to preserve and ferment, to garden and forage in a strange way. These modern movements are rediscovering principles that medieval peasants knew intimately, not because medieval peasants were somehow wiser, but because their constraints forced them to develop sophisticated strategies for feeding themselves sustainably from their local environment. Now let's talk about something that might disturb you: the question of animal welfare and medieval peasant agriculture. Because the animals that provided medieval peasants with meat, dairy, and eggs live very different lives than most food animals today. Medieval pigs, chickens, cows, and sheep weren't raised in the concentrated animal feeding operations that produce most meat today. They lived more natural lives, even if they were ultimately slaughtered for food. Pigs foraged in forests and on common lands. They lived in conditions much closer to their natural behavior than modern confined pigs. Chickens ranged freely, scratching for insects and seeds. Cattle and sheep grazed on pastures and commons. This doesn't mean medieval people were concerned about animal welfare in the way modern people might be. Animals were resources, tools for survival. But the systems they used to raise these animals were, arguably, more humane than modern industrial systems. There's an irony here. Medieval peasants, who we often think of as brutal and unsophisticated, might have treated food animals better than we do with all our modern concern for animal welfare. Their animals lived better lives, even if they eventually met the same end. This raises questions about the true cost of our modern abundance. We can eat meat daily, something most medieval peasants couldn't do. But that meat comes from animals raised in conditions that would probably shock medieval peasants. Is that progress? I'm not suggesting we should go back to medieval agricultural systems. Feeding the modern world population would be impossible with medieval technology. But it is worth asking whether there are ways to incorporate some of the principles of medieval animal husbandry into modern systems. Some farmers are trying to do exactly that, raising animals on pasture and more natural conditions. Let's talk now about something that connects medieval peasant food to our present moment: climate change. Because the medieval period experienced significant climate variation, and this had enormous effects on food systems. The medieval warm period, roughly 950 to 1250, saw temperatures in Europe rise. This extended the growing season and allowed cultivation further north than before. Vineyards appeared in England. Grain could be grown at higher elevations. This warming contributed to population growth and agricultural expansion. But then came the Little Ice Age, beginning around 1300 and lasting into the 19th century. Temperatures dropped, growing seasons shortened, harvests failed. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 was partly triggered by this climate shift. Medieval peasants had no control over climate and no understanding of why it was changing. They could only adapt as best they could, and when adaptation failed, they starved. We're now in a period of rapid climate change, but unlike medieval peasants, we understand the causes and have the potential to address them. The question is whether we will. Climate change threatens global food systems in ways that would have seemed apocalyptic. To medieval peasants, rising temperatures, changing precipitation patterns, more frequent extreme weather events, all of these threaten agriculture. The sophisticated, localized food systems that medieval peasants developed wouldn't survive the kind of rapid climate change we were experiencing. But maybe the resilient strategies they used, the dietary diversity, the preservation techniques, the local knowledge, maybe these have something to teach us about how to build more resilient food systems in an uncertain climate future. I want to talk now about something that has been implicit throughout this discussion, but needs to be made explicit: gratitude. Medieval peasants lived with an awareness of their dependence on the land, the weather, the harvest that most modern people have lost. When your survival depends directly on the harvest, when one failed crop can mean starvation, you develop a profound appreciation for food. Grace before meals wasn't just a rote religious practice. It was a genuine expression of gratitude for the gift of food. Harvest festivals weren't just parties. They were celebrations of survival, expressions of relief and gratitude that the harvest had come in, that there would be food for the winter. Most modern people in wealthy countries have lost this. Food is abundant, cheap, and always available. We waste enormous quantities. We throw away food that is perfectly edible because we don't like how it looks or because it has passed an arbitrary date stamp on the package. Medieval peasants would be horrified by our waste. Every scrap of food had value. Stale bread became breadcrumbs or went into pottage. Vegetable scraps fed animals. Bones were boiled for broth and then ground for fertilizer. Nothing was wasted. There's a spiritual dimension to this that goes beyond religion. It's about recognizing our fundamental dependence on food systems, on the work that goes into producing food, on the gift of food itself. Some modern food movements are trying to recover this awareness. Mindful eating, reducing food waste, appreciating the labor and resources that go into producing food. These are attempts to rediscover something that medieval peasants knew instinctively. Now let's consider the legacy of medieval peasant food. How did these foodways influence what came after? What traces remain in modern cuisines? Many traditional European dishes have their roots in medieval peasant cooking. French pot au feu, a slowly simmered mixture of meat and vegetables, is essentially medieval pottage evolved and refined. Italian minestrone, Spanish cocido, German Eintopf, all of these are descendants of the peasant one-pot meals we've been discussing. Preservation techniques developed in the medieval period remain in use. Salted and smoked fish, aged cheeses, sauerkraut, dried beans and peas. All of these are medieval technologies that we still use. Some specific foods have endured. Rye bread, especially in Northern and Eastern Europe, connects directly to medieval peasant bread traditions. So do various porridges and grain-based dishes. But much has been lost. Specific vegetable varieties that medieval peasants grew are extinct. Preservation techniques have been forgotten as refrigeration and modern food systems made them unnecessary. Knowledge about wild foods, about foraging, about making use of every part of an animal or plant, much of this has disappeared. There are people trying to recover these lost foodways. Researchers growing medieval vegetable varieties, chefs recreating medieval dishes, historians documenting medieval food practices. This work is valuable not just for historical understanding, but as a resource for thinking about future food systems. Because medieval peasant food systems, for all their limitations and vulnerabilities, were sustainable in ways that modern industrial agriculture is not. They built soil rather than depleting it. They maintained diversity rather than monocropping. They worked with local conditions rather than trying to override them with technology. Again, I'm not suggesting we should or could go back to medieval agriculture, but understanding how these systems work, what they got right, and what their limitations were, gives us tools for thinking about how to make modern food systems more sustainable and resilient. Let me share something with you now that pulls all of this together. A hypothetical but realistic description of a single day in the life of a medieval peasant focused on food. This will help make concrete everything we've been discussing. It's late summer, August, in the year 1280. You wake in your cottage just before dawn. The baked fire still smolders, and the pot of pottage that's been simmering all night is ready. You ladle out a bowl. The base is barley and oats, cooked until thick and creamy. In it are dried peas that have softened overnight, chunks of turnip and carrot, shreds of yesterday's cabbage, and a ham bone that's been giving up its flavor for 2 days. You season it with onions, garlic, and parsley from your garden. You tear off a piece of yesterday's bread, dark and dense with rye and wheat, and dip it in the pottage. You wash it down with small ale, slightly sour but refreshing. After this meal, you head to the fields. It's harvest time, the most critical period of the agricultural year. You'll work until midday with only a brief pause for a drink of ale and perhaps a piece of bread and cheese. At midday, you return to the cottage for the main meal. Your wife has been working in the garden and has gathered fresh kale, beans, and onions. She's added these to the pottage pot along with some fresh herbs. The pottage has transformed, now green with kale and rich with fresh beans. There's more of the dark bread, and your wife has brought out a small piece of smoked bacon that adds saltiness and fat to the meal. There's cheese, a hard-aged cheese that's been in the cellar, and more ale. After eating, you rest for perhaps an hour, then return to the harvest work. In late afternoon, you take another break. More bread, more ale, maybe an apple from the tree near the cottage. Evening comes, and you're exhausted from the day's labor. Supper is lighter. The pottage again, thinner now because it's been eaten from all day. Some of the fresh beans cooked simply with herbs.bread.ale. Maybe a bit of butter to spread on the bread, a treat because your wife churned yesterday. Before sleeping, you bake the fire, ensuring the pottage pot will continue its slow simmer through the night, ready for tomorrow's breakfast. The cycle will continue. Over the coming weeks, as harvest progresses, there will be days when you slaughter a chicken or have access to fresh fish. There will be feast days when you eat better. But this day is typical, and this food, simple as it is, provides what you need to fuel your hard labor. This is a good day, a normal day during a time of plenty. Next winter will bring a different rhythm, different foods from storage and preservation. Next spring might bring lean times before the first harvests. But for now, you're fed, your family is fed, and the work continues. Does this picture surprise you? It's so different from the starving peasant eating gruel that popular culture has planted in our minds. But this is what the evidence suggests was normal for many medieval peasants in non-crisis times. Now I want to address something important. The question of whether we've been too positive in this portrayal. Have we overcorrected, painting too rosy a picture of medieval peasant life? The truth requires nuance. Yes, medieval peasants had more diverse and adequate diets than popular myth suggests, but their lives were still hard in ways that modern people struggle to imagine. Even outside of famines, child mortality was high, disease was ever present, the work was backbreaking and never-ending. Food security, even when things were going well, was precarious. One bad harvest, one outbreak of livestock disease, one period of war disrupting agricultural work. Any of these could push a household from adequacy to desperation. Medieval peasants had few rights and little freedom compared to modern people. They lived under systems of obligation and hierarchy that constrained their choices. They couldn't leave their land without permission. They owed labor and payments to lords. They faced violence and injustice with little recourse. So while we should correct the myth of constant starvation, we shouldn't romanticize medieval peasant life. It was better than the caricature. But it was still difficult, precarious, and constrained by modern standards. The point isn't to say medieval peasants had it good. It's to say they were resourceful, sophisticated people who developed complex strategies for feeding themselves within the constraints they faced. They deserve our respect and accurate understanding, not pity based on false assumptions. Let's talk now about one final aspect of medieval peasant food that we haven't fully explored. Taste. What did this food actually taste like? Would we find it palatable? This is difficult to answer definitively because taste is subjective and culturally conditioned. But we can make some educated guesses based on the ingredients and methods we discussed. Medieval pottage, well made with fresh vegetables and herbs, would probably taste quite good to modern palates. Think of it as a hearty vegetable stew. The combination of grains, legumes, vegetables, and meat or fish creates umami, that satisfying savory depth. The herbs add brightness and complexity. The bread would taste different from modern bread, denser, more textured, with the complex flavors of mixed grains. Some people would love it. Others might find it too heavy or assertive compared to the mild flavor of modern white bread. The ale would be challenging for modern drinkers used to filtered, hop beer. Medieval ale was cloudy, often slightly sour, with flavors from the root herbs rather than the clean bitterness of hops. But people who enjoy traditional farmhouse ales might find it interesting and pleasant. Preserved foods would be more challenging. Heavily salted fish would be quite salty by modern standards. Smoked meats would be more intensely flavored than what we're used to. But these were the flavors medieval people knew and presumably enjoyed. Fresh seasonal foods would taste familiar and good. A fresh apple is a fresh apple. Berries are berries. Fresh vegetables prepared simply would taste much like they do today, though the specific varieties might have slightly different flavor profiles. What medieval peasant food wouldn't taste like is modern processed food. No refined sugar, so no cloying sweetness, no artificial flavors, no corn syrup or partially hydrogenated oils. The flavors would be direct, honest, derived from the ingredients themselves. Some people participating in medieval food recreation projects have reported that they genuinely enjoy the food once they adjust to the different flavor profiles. Others find it different from what they're used to. But almost everyone agrees it's far better than they expected. Based on the medieval peasant food stereotype, This brings us to our conclusion, to trying to pull together everything we've explored and understand what it means. The story of medieval peasant food is ultimately a story about resilience, ingenuity, and the fundamental human drive to not just survive, but to find meaning, pleasure, and community around food even in difficult circumstances. Medieval peasants developed sophisticated food systems adapted to their specific environmental and social contexts. They understood seasonality, preservation, nutrition, and flavor in ways that deserve our respect. They faced enormous challenges and vulnerabilities, but they met these challenges with strategies that often worked remarkably well. They weren't the ignorant, starving wretches of popular imagination. They were complex people living complex lives, and their foodways reflected that complexity. Their diet, while certainly limited by modern standards and vulnerable to disruption, was in normal times adequate and even nutritious. The myths about medieval peasant food reveal more about our own assumptions and prejudices than about historical reality. They reflect class biases, both medieval and modern. They reflect our need to believe in progress, to feel that we're better off than people in the past. They reflect the incompleteness of historical records and our tendency to generalize from crisis to normalcy. But modern research, combining historical sources with archaeological science, is giving us a more accurate picture. And that picture should change how we think about the medieval period, about peasants, about food, and about the relationship between them. What can we take from this for our own time? Perhaps an appreciation for food that we've largely lost. Perhaps an understanding that sophisticated food systems don't require modern technology, though they benefit from it. Perhaps a recognition that diversity, seasonality, and working with rather than against natural systems creates resilience. We live in a time of food abundance, unlike anything medieval people could have imagined. But we also face challenges they didn't. Climate change threatens global food systems. Industrial agriculture depletes soil and depends on unsustainable inputs. Food waste is staggering. Nutrition-related health problems plague wealthy nations. Maybe looking back at how medieval peasants fed themselves, understanding both what worked and what didn't, can give us tools for thinking about how to build better food systems for the future. Not by going backward, but by learning from the principles that allow people to feed themselves sustainably for generations. The medieval peasant standing over that pot of pottage, adding vegetables from the garden and herbs from the hedgerow, maintaining knowledge passed down through generations, working with the seasons and the land. That person has something to teach us, not because their life was easy or ideal, but because they understood fundamental truths about food, community, and sustainability that we're in danger of forgetting. As we face our own food challenges in the 21st century, as we grapple with how to feed a growing global population while preserving the environment and promoting health, we might do well to remember the sophistication hidden in that supposedly simple peasant meal. The diversity, the seasonality, the minimal waste, the connection to place and community. Medieval peasants couldn't have imagined our modern world, with its supermarkets and global food supply chains, its year-round availability of any food we might desire. But I wonder what they would think of our relationship with food. Would they be amazed by our abundance? Certainly. But would they also be puzzled by our waste, our disconnection from food sources, our chronic diet-related diseases? The truth about medieval peasant food is more complex, more interesting, and more relevant than the simple myths suggest. It's a truth that challenges our assumptions, that forces us to see medieval people as the sophisticated, resourceful humans they were. And that might even have lessons for how we think about food today. So the next time you see a depiction of medieval peasants eating watery gruel and moldy bread, remember what you now know. Remember the pottage rich with vegetables and herbs. Remember the diverse diet adapted to local conditions. Remember the sophisticated preservation techniques. Remember the gardens and the commons and the carefully managed food systems. Remember that these people, our ancestors, fed themselves and their families through their knowledge, their labor, and their ingenuity. They weren't just surviving, they were living, and food was central to their life in ways both practical and profound. And maybe, just maybe, ask yourself what they would think of how we eat today. What would a medieval peasant make of our processed foods, our food waste, our disconnection from the sources of our sustenance? What wisdom might they offer if they could speak to us across the centuries? The conversation between past and present, between their food and ours, between their challenges and ours, that's a conversation worth having. Because in understanding how medieval peasants actually fed themselves, we might just learn something about how we should feed ourselves now and in the future.